Greetings and welcome to the Plsql channel, a series of video trainings in the Oracle Plsql language. My name is Stephen Feuerstein, and I'm a Plsql developer just like you. This lesson is part of my series on dynamic SQL and dynamic Plsql, and the focus of this lesson is executing dynamic DML statements with bind variables. This is method 2 dynamic SQL. Some quick reminders. If you haven't already done so, visit Plsql Obsession, toadworld.com/sf, where you can download all the files that I'll be demonstrating and using in my lesson. Essentially what you do is go to Plsql Obsession, click on the demo zip link, and that zip file will contain all the files that I'll be running. And you can also visit the training seminars and presentations page to download PowerPoints that support my various trainings. In addition, make sure you're comfortable with the material covered in the previous lessons in this series. Take a look at Introduction and Overview and executing DDL and simple DML. That's called Method 1 Dynamic SQL. So for example, if you're not terribly familiar with the fact that there are 4 different methods of dynamic SQL and why the one I'm about to talk about is Method 2, watch the Introduction and Overview video. So, Method 2. Method 2 dynamic SQL involves executing dynamic DML statements, update, delete, merge, inserts, with a fixed number of bind variables. Now, what I mean by bind variables is that you're going to be binding expressions to placeholders in the dynamic SQL string with the using clause of execute immediate. So first of all, what's a placeholder? Well, when you're constructing a string with SQL statements inside of it, you can reference a placeholder, basically reference a point in which a value needs to be put into your dynamic SQL statement using a colon and then a name or even conceivably an integer value. Here's an example of an integer placeholder and a string placeholder. So whenever you see the colon followed immediately by a name or an integer, you know that that's a placeholder. And when you run the SQL statement, Oracle needs a value to stick into that placeholder, to bind a value into it. And the way you bind is with the using clause. So here's a quick initial example. I'm constructing my DML string inside a loop. My table is dynamic, so I have to do this with execute immediate. I construct my update statement. Notice I've got a placeholder here, a placeholder here, and a placeholder here, strings and integers. And then in my execute immediate statement, I have a using clause, and then I specify a variable or an expression for each one of the placeholders in my string. Dynamic SQL Method 2 means that at the time I write my SQL statement and at the time the code is compiled, I know how many different placeholders I've got. 1, 2, 3, and therefore my using clause can specify my 3 expressions. If I don't know how many bind variables I've got, maybe 2, maybe 16, that's a much more complex scenario, and that's called Method 4 Dynamic SQL, and that's treated and addressed in a separate lesson. So in this lesson, we're assuming that at the time you compile your code, you know how many bind variables you've got, which is certainly the most common kind of scenario for Method 2 DML operations. Let's get into a bit more detail on the using clause and look at a bunch of examples. When you specify a value in the using clause, you can also specify its mode, essentially the same as parameters in, out, and in out. In is the default. If you don't specify anything, you get in, just like parameters. Out and in out are really used for dynamic Plsql. When you're doing dynamic DML operations, insert, update, deletes, you're only passing values in. The number of placeholders must match the number of bind variables, even if you have the same placeholder referenced more than once. Basically, the expressions are allocated positionally. You cannot bind expressions of Plsql data type, for example, records, booleans, associative arrays. The using clause is passing or binding values into the SQL statement, and therefore only SQL types are supported. This is true even for dynamic Plsql, which is addressed in a separate lesson. Essentially, the data type must be known to the SQL layer in order to do the binding. Finally, you cannot bind parts of the SQL statement that are needed for parsing. So for example, if I have a dynamic column name or a table name or a where clause, a chunk of text, I cannot use a bind variable in the using clause to bind that information in. Instead, I must concatenate. All right, Let's take a look at a whole bunch of examples. I'm going to create a copy of my employees table so any changes I make will not be affecting my main table. And first what I'm going to do is demonstrate that you can't bind parts of the SQL statement needed for parsing. So set to 10,000. I want to set all the employees salaries, or sorry, the dynamic part of my statement is I'm passing in the column name and the department ID. So in my DML statement, my column name is dynamic. It's not known at compile time, and therefore it's not a static DML statement. And in my first attempt to write my DML statement, I'm going to try to bind in the name of the column with a placeholder. And then I'm going to give everybody a salary, or the specified column, salary, commission, etc. I'm going to set their value to 10,000 for the specified department ID. So everybody in department 50 will get a salary of $10,000. And then after I run my statement, I'll see how many rows I modified. So first of all, will this code even compile? And the answer is yes, no problem. Because it's a dynamic SQL string, Oracle doesn't really take a look at how it's constructed, what it might do until runtime. And at runtime, when I try to say update the employee salaries to 10,000 for department ID 50, well, Oracle complains. Invalid user table column, table.column, or column specification. In other words, it found that you were trying to specify a column without actually giving the column name, and that's not valid. So dynamic table names, column names, where clauses, from clauses, all of that stuff have to be concatenated in. So let's take a look at doing it right, and then also binding in various kinds of variables. Okay, my set to 10,000 program takes the same column, department ID. Now I'm going to say update the employees table, set the column name is concatenated in, equal to 10,000 for the specified department ID. So then I can run this program, set to 10,000 for the salary, 50, and now I don't have the problem of having to bind in the column name. So I think this is going to work. We'll try it. But first of all, note at the top of this script when you run it yourself that you'll need to run the tab count NDS script first. Let's take a look at that. The tab count function is actually a function using dynamic SQL method 3, which we haven't covered yet. So if you're not familiar with querying data dynamically, this might be a little bit new to you, and you'll learn all about it in lesson 3. But essentially what I'm going to do is, instead of writing select count star over and over again, I've got a separate program that will do the select count star for me from the specified table and the specified where clause. So there's the concatenation of the where clause. And again, it cannot be bound in. I've got to concatenate it. Now, some of you with lots of experience might look at this and say, this is a dangerous thing to do because it might introduce the possibility of SQL injection. I talk about SQL injection in my best practices for dynamic SQL, and it's absolutely true that it does raise this possibility. We're not going to worry about that for this simple utility. I'm going to compile table count. What that lets me do is, inside my script, after creating my program, say, after creating my program, that should work, show me the table count for everybody in the employees M2 table where department ID equals 50 and salary equals 10,000. So I'm supplying an entire where clause as well as the schema name and the table name. So the before count and then the after count. First of all, let's create this procedure. So there's my dynamic update statement. Here's my binding, and if I want to, I can also say using in, and that will compile as well. Now let's try running it. Now I don't get an error, and in fact I see that 45 rows were updated in the process of performing this update statement. So the before count was 0, the after count 45. And notice also that as a part of my procedure, I check to see the number of rows modified. So SQL% row count will also reflect the number of rows modified by a dynamic SQL statement, essentially the most recent SQL statement executed. That will give you the row count for it, the number of rows modified. Okay, that worked. Let's see what happens if I change my bind variable type to out. Oh, look at this. It won't even let me compile. expression department ID cannot be used as an assignment target. So it's saying you can't pass the value back in. Well, the problem here is that is probably not what I want to show you. Since this is an in parameter, it's saying you can't change it, and that's a value coming back. So let's just make that a little bit different. Department is a number. Let's put it here. Whoops. Let's put it here. Try to compile. And now Oracle does compile my program. It says, okay, you want to use that as an out, that's fine. Let's try running it. And it says outbound variable bound to an in position. So it's trying to get the value to put it in something, and then I've specified it as out, so that will not work. So you've got to have the mode set correctly. Generally speaking, people just don't include the mode, just using that variable puts it in. Okay, so that's a single bind variable. Let's take a look at using multiple bind variables. I'm going to pass in the column name, the department ID, and the value that I want to set the salary or the commission or whatever it is to. So now my statement is a bit more complex. I'm going to set my column value equal to the specified value for that department ID, but it's no big deal. I simply provide two expressions, or variables in this case, or parameters in this case, that will be bound into the statement. When I do this, I should again see the same 45. Run my code, and I see 45 rows updated. So again, if you have multiple bind variables, you simply have to, multiple placeholders, you have to make sure that you have the same number of bind variables in your using clause. And that's true even if you have duplicates of the same. So here's an example of my same update numeric value procedure, column department ID value. But now I've said set the column equal to that specified value for this department ID, and only if the value that I've passed in is not null. Now clearly what I should have done is say if val in is not null. So this doesn't really need to be a bind variable, but let's just assume we did it that way. So I've got 1, 2, 3 placeholders. I have to have 1, 2, 3 placeholders inside my using clause. So Oracle assigns them positionally, and in fact, if I wanted to, I could provide different values. I could say val in times 100 here. It doesn't have to be the same expression, but you have to provide a value for each element in the list. Let's try that. Now first of all, let's go back to just 2. So I've got 3 placeholders, 2 bind variables. Will this code even compile? And the answer is yes, it will compile because Oracle isn't looking inside the string at compile time. All that processing is deferred till runtime. When I try to run the program, then it tells me, hey, wait a minute. I've got to bind 3 different values to 3 placeholders, and not all of them were bound. So that's the error you get if you have a mismatch in the number. But if I add the value in here as well, then I have no problem. So make sure your bind variables and your placeholders match up by number. And by the way, that's only true for dynamic SQL.